There are a number of theories of socialization that address how we become the people we are or how different aspects of who we are develop. And so we're going to take a look at both some sociological theories of socialization as well as some psychological theories of socialization. So we're going to start with some of the sociological theories of socialization. And one of those early sociological theories is the theory of a person named Charles Wharton Cooley. And he coined this concept, the looking glass self. He suggested that we come to see ourselves through the lenses of others. So he believed that we sort of develop our own sense of who we are based on how we think that other people see us. So, in his view, there are three phases of developing that self identity of who we are. First, we imagine how we present ourselves to others. So, when we're in those social settings, we think about how we're presenting ourselves, what we're doing, how we are, in a sense, performing those roles. And then the second phase is we imagine how others evaluate us. So we think about what they think about us. We think about how they evaluate our performance or what they think of the way we behave, the way we act in different situations. And then the third phase is we develop feelings about ourselves as a result of those impressions. So we start to feel a certain way about ourselves based on what we think other people see in us or what they perceive in us. This looking glass self is kind of a broader view of what's called double consciousness, the division of a person's identity into two or more social realities. This is something that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about as he talked about his experiences being a black man in America. Um, Sort of navigating between these different social realities. And that's a concept that we'll talk about more as we move on to race and ethnicity later in the semester. So that's what Cooley suggested about the looking glass self. Another sociological theory of socialization is the theory of George Herbert Mead. And George Herbert Mead really looked at how we develop our sense of self, our sense of who we are. And he suggested that there are three stages in the development of self: the preparatory stage, the play stage, and the game stage. So there are different things that are happening in these different stages based on what kids are capable of at each of these different stages. So to begin with, children in that preparatory stage tend to imitate the people around them. So they're beginning to understand symbols. They know that certain things stand for or represent other things. And a good way that we see that, or one of the big ways we see that, is when kids start using language. Language is a system of symbols, so they're beginning to understand symbols and how things represent other things or represent certain meanings or definitions. And so they start to imitate. But to begin with, that imitation is just basic mimicry. They don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. They're just copying what other people do. So it doesn't really have much of a purpose in that preparatory stage. But then in the play stage, the second stage in the development of self, children start to be more aware of social relationships. And so it's in this stage that they can pretend to be other people. So eventually we see kids beginning that pretend play as they get on into the preschool years. And when they're capable of doing that, they're in this play stage. So they are what Mead called role taking. And role taking is basically just the process of assuming the perspective of another and responding from that person's viewpoint. So as they move on up through those middle school or those toddler years, those preschool years, they begin to be able to do that. Now, the third stage is what Mead called the game stage. And he suggested that children who are around age 8 or 9 no longer just play roles. He believed that kids at this age can really start to grasp their social positions and the social positions of others, that they can really start to understand where they are, and so those different statuses they occupy, and how those statuses fit in with the statuses of other people in their environment. And so he used this concept, the generalized other. The generalized other, according to Mead, includes the attitudes, viewpoints, and expectations of society as a whole that a child takes into account in managing their own behavior. So this generalized other, Mead argued that when children get to this game stage, they are capable of seeing things from the perspective of that generalized other. They can think about what those attitudes and viewpoints of others in society might be and what others might think of their behavior. Now, in Mead's theory of self, he suggested that the self begins as a privileged central position in a person's world. Young children think they're the focus of everything around them, but as a person matures, the self changes and it begins to reflect greater concern about the reaction of others. So another term that's part of his theory is what's called the significant other. And of course, you've heard that term before, but that means an individual who is very important in the development of ourself. So significant others, when it comes to developing our sense of self, might be people like our parents, our friends, teachers, those people that we come in contact with on a regular basis. Those would be those significant others. But he was arguing that we begin to sort of take their perspective and imagine what we might look like or how they might perceive our behavior. So Mead suggested that the development of self is something that occurs throughout childhood. And so some major points from his theory. First of all, he argues that there is no self at birth, that the self is not there at birth, that it's something that develops in those first years of life. And he further argues that it develops through social experience. So we've talked about socialization as social experience and how important that socialization is. Well, he argued that it's through that social experience that our sense of self really starts to develop. So social experience then is the exchange of symbols. So when we talk to each other, when we use symbols that mean something to us to communicate with others and that sort of thing. And then as part of that process, we have to seek meaning. We have to, as other people are using those symbols with us, we have to try to think about what they mean by those symbols, what the intention is behind their use of those symbols. So Mead talked about seeking meaning. We seek meaning in those symbols, and so seeking meaning leads us to imagine other people's intentions. When we look at those symbols that they're using and try to interpret them, we're trying to think about what their intentions are, and we try to think about the situation from their perspective. He further argues that understanding intention requires that we be able to imagine the situation from others' points of view, so from the way other people see us. And so it's his view that by doing that, by imagining how others view us and taking the role of the other, that's how we become self-aware. So those are kind of 6 main points that are part of needs theory in the development of self. And you also, if you're using the Schaefer textbook, you have this table that shows those different stages of the self, and some information about each of those stages. So even if you don't have access to the Schaefer text, you can look at that table here. Now, another theory about socialization and the development of self that comes from more of a sociological perspective is the theory of Irving Goffman. And we've been talking a little bit about Irving Goffman. We talked about Goffman as we talked about social interaction and the social construction of reality, and how we understand reality, how we can analyze using Goffman's dramaturgical analysis. Goffman suggested that a lot of our daily activities involve attempts to convey certain impressions of who we are to others. So a big part of his theory is this idea of impression management. He suggests that a lot of what we do when we're out there performing our roles is we're trying to manage the impressions that other people have of us. And so he defined impression management as the altering of the presentation of self in order to create distinctive appearances and to satisfy particular audiences. So we try to present ourselves in such a way that other people start to think certain things about us. And of course, that dramaturgical approach we've talked a little bit about, that's his view that we can look at and analyze social interaction between people in terms of theatrical performances, and that can help us better understand social interaction. And so he suggested that a lot of what we do as we're engaged in impression management is what he called face work. And face work refers to those efforts that we make to maintain a proper image. So what we do to continue to appear a particular way in the minds of others, and then how we can avoid embarrassment as part of that process. So again, he looks at how we interact with others, and based on that, how we develop that sense of self. Now, in addition to those sociological theories of socialization, we also have several psychological theories that address some of the same kinds of things. And one of those theories is the theory of Sigmund Freud. And of course, Freud's name is one that you may have heard of before. If you've taken a psychology class, chances are you've heard of Freud in there. But Freud's theory addresses the development of personality. He suggested that our personalities develop through a series of stages, and his early work stressed the importance of these inborn drives that we have and how those inborn drives come into play in the development of personality. So he suggested that we have these basic human needs, eros and thanatos, and so that's what drives a lot of our behavior. So those are those inborn drives that we have. Eros, the life instinct, and thanatos, the death instinct. And so those are two opposing forces of basic needs. And he suggests that those come into play, those inborn drives come into play in the development of our sense of who we are, our sense of self. So he suggests that the self is a social product, that it has components that work in opposition to each other. So much like those inborn drives work in opposition to each other, he suggested that the self, or the personality, has these components that work against each other as well. And so those components, in his view, included the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is the part of our personality, according to Freud, that is present at birth. So it's sort of the unsocialized part of who we are, and it's the part of our personality that's really operating on the basis of those basic drives. So that's where Eros and Thanatos come into play, and that infant's desire to seek pleasure and that kind of thing. But as we get a little bit older, another part of our self develops, the ego. And the ego is the part of our personality that's a little bit more rational and reasonable. And one of the things that the ego does, really the big thing the ego does, its major task, is to balance out the other parts of the personality. So the third part of the personality, the superego, is how we internalize some of those moral standards and those standards for being a good person that our society has. So the superego is the moral branch of our personality, and it's the part of our personality that wants us to be good. So if you think about it, the id and the superego are sort of in opposition, much like Eros and Thanatos. The id wants us to seek pleasure. The superego wants us to do the right thing, the good thing. And so the ego is left in the middle, trying to mediate between the id and the superego. So the ego makes those efforts to achieve balance between those other two parts of the personality. So Freud suggested that most of the time the ego is capable of doing that, but sometimes the ego has a hard time with that, and it's during those times that we run into problems or begin to use what he called defense mechanisms, things like denial and repression, as a way to deal with some of the anxiety that we might be experiencing. Another sociological theory of socialization that addresses the development of personality is the theory of Erik Erikson. And Erikson, like Freud, felt that there are certain inborn drives that we have, but he suggested it's what happens to us in our social context that really comes into play and has a huge role in determining who we are and what we become in life. So he suggested that there are these different crises that we face at different times in the lifespan, and it's how we resolve these crises that determines where our personality is going to be. So the first four stages in his theory are the stages of childhood up to adolescence. And so stage one, that first stage during infancy, is a stage of trust versus mistrust. Erikson pointed out that in infancy, we're pretty dependent on people around us to help us get our needs met. And it's how those people help us get our needs met that determines whether we develop more of a sense of trust or more of a sense of distrust in the world. If our needs are met in a fairly consistent and reliable fashion, then Erikson believed that we would develop more of a sense of trust, more of a sense that the world is a safe place, I can trust in people, and that kind of thing. But if our needs are not met in a consistent and reliable fashion, then we might develop more of a sense of distrust. And it might be harder for us to develop relationships with others and that sort of thing. The second stage in his theory is the stage of toddlerhood, and he suggested that the crisis of toddlerhood is one of autonomy or independence. And toddlers are trying to express their independence. That's part of the reason they can be kind of difficult sometimes, because they've discovered that they are separate from other people in their environment. And so they have their own minds and they want to use their own minds and assert their own will. So he suggested that if we encourage their independence to some degree, that they could develop more of a sense of autonomy. But they have to remember that they can't be completely independent yet, that they can't do everything on their own, that they still need some help with a lot of things. So that autonomy has to be tempered a little bit. But you can think about some of the things that kids in that toddlerhood stage do that suggest that they're really trying to express that independence or that autonomy. There's one little word that children in the toddler years tend to use a lot, the word no, and that's a way for them to assert that independence or that autonomy. Children in this stage tend to want to do things on their own. And so Erickson felt that as their parents, as their caregivers, as others in their environment, we need to encourage that autonomy as much as we can, but we have to remember that they can't be completely autonomous, that they can't be completely independent, because after all, they are still toddlers and there's a lot of stuff that they can't do and their thinking skills haven't fully developed yet. So we have to kind of temper that autonomy a little bit. Now, when kids move on into the preschool years, Erickson suggested that the crisis is one of initiative. So this stage is sometimes called initiative versus guilt. And he suggested that at this stage, children are really interested in doing things, in trying to develop new skills, and to feel like partners with other people in their environment, or at least to feel like they're working with those other people around them. And so one of the things that you'll see as children try to express that initiative is that they want to try to help. They want to try to do things that they see their parents, their older siblings, other people in their environment doing. So, for example, they may want to help wash dishes or help with other tasks around the house. And that's their way of showing that initiative. Now, in the pre-adolescence years, so more of the school-age years prior to adolescence, Erickson suggested that that is a period of industriousness, or at least that's what's important during that period. So this stage is sometimes called industry versus inferiority. He pointed out that at this stage, a lot of kids are beginning to do a lot of social comparison. Because they're in school, they have a lot of opportunities to compare themselves to their classmates, to see how they're developing their skills. And so he felt that if children, when they compare themselves to their classmates, if they feel like they're doing okay, they're developing those skills at about the same rate as their classmates, they're not really falling behind or anything like that, that they would develop more of a sense of industry. But if they feel as if they're not developing at the same level or not developing those skills at the same rate, then they may experience more of a sense of inferiority. And so those are the first four stages in Erickson's theory. And then that fifth stage is one of identity development. And so he suggested that depending on what's happened in those earlier stages, that's what determines how we develop that sense of who we are, that sense of identity in adolescence. Now, another theory of socialization is the theory of a Swiss biologist named Jean Piaget. And Piaget's theory addresses the socialization of thinking skills and how thinking skills developed. He stressed the importance of social interactions in the development of those thinking skills, and he suggested that newborns really have no self in the sense of a looking glass image. He argued that they're really quite self-centered and that they're demanding all the attention be directed toward them. But as they mature, they're gradually socialized into social relationships. And so he suggested that as children move through childhood, they pass through these stages, this series of 4 stages in the development of their cognitive abilities. So those stages include the sensory motor stage, first couple of years of life, the pre-operational stage, those preschool years from about 2 to like 5, 6, maybe even 7, concrete operational stage, which would be those school age years, and then the formal operational stage, which is when we get to adolescence. He pointed out that in that sensory motor stage, with newborns and those young infants, they're taking in a lot of information through their senses, and they're learning how to coordinate that with their motor behavior. So that's why it's called the sensory motor stage. And he suggested that that's what children are developing during this stage, that sensory contact understanding, what that sensory information means, and then what we can do in response. So how we behave, what we do in return. Now, the pre-operational stage is a stage that kids are in those preschool years, and he suggested that during this stage, children start to use words and symbols to distinguish objects and ideas, but he felt that children were pretty limited in their thinking at this stage. One of the limitations of pre-operational thought is what he called egocentrism. He suggested that children in this stage can't really take the perspective of others. So they can only think about how the world looks from their own perspective. They can't really think about how other people might see a situation. So you might see this in that little kid who gets on the phone and is talking to someone, and the person on the other end of the line might ask a yes or no question. And rather than saying yes or no, that child may either nod their head or shake their head. That's because they're still egocentric in their thinking, and they can't yet take the perspective of others, and they don't really understand that that person on the other end of the line cannot actually see them, that they don't see what the child sees. So even though children are starting to use language and other symbols, in this stage, they're still pretty limited in their thinking. Now, in the concrete operational stage, he suggested that children start to engage in more logical thinking. He argued that they're beginning to understand the connections in their surroundings, and so they can use logic to think their way through a problem or a situation. But while they're capable of using logic and performing what he called mental operations, he suggested that they're still very limited in a lot of ways. And the really big way in which they're limited is that their thought is very concrete. They think in very concrete terms. So they tend to be very literal in their thought. A great example of concrete operational thought is the children's book character Amelia Bedelia. Some of you may have read Amelia Bedelia books when you were young, or maybe you had people who read them to you. But Amelia Bedelia was this children's book character who was a housekeeper. And even though she was an adult, her thinking was much more like a child in those school age years, in that concrete operational stage. She was very literal in her thinking about the world. A good example of that, in one instance in one of the books, her employer asked her to draw the curtains. And so you might expect her to go in and get the curtains and pull them together, to draw the curtains. But because she takes things very literally, she would be more of a concrete operational thinker. Instead of drawing the curtains by pulling them together, she actually gets a sketch pad and a pencil and physically draws the curtains rather than pulling the curtains together. And that's a lot like a concrete operational thinker. They can perform those mental operations, but they are still very concrete or very literal in their thinking. And then the formal operational stage is the stage Piaget suggested we move into in adolescence. And he also suggested that that's the highest level of thinking. He suggested that adolescents become capable of much more sophisticated thought. They become capable of abstract thought. And so that's what differentiates the concrete operational stage from the formal operational stage. Children overcome those limitations of being very concrete and very literal, and they can think abstractly. So they can they can engage in critical thinking, and they can be very logical with their ideas and values and that sort of thing. Now, another cognitive theory, it's a psychological theory, but it addresses cognitive development, is the theory of Lawrence Kohlberg. And his theory addresses moral development, the development of thinking about moral issues and moral dilemmas. And so he suggested that we sort of proceed through 3 different periods of moral development, what he called the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional. He suggested in that pre-conventional stage, or that pre-conventional period, most young children experience the world as pain or pleasure, and they want to do the things that will help them avoid pain and allow them to experience pleasure. So when it comes to moral issues, in their mind, the things that are right are those things that make them feel good, that lead to their experience of pleasure and allow them to avoid their experience of pain. But as kids move on through those years of childhood and then on into early adolescence, they start to think more about rules and laws and moral issues, but they also start to think more about other people and about society and how society views their behavior. And so he suggested that as they move into this conventional stage, teens really begin to lose that selfishness because they're learning how to define right and wrong in terms of what pleases others. So they're concerned about what makes them look good in the eyes of other people. So in the eyes of their parents, in the eyes of other people that they know, in the eyes of society as a whole. So they start to conform to what their parents want them to be or what they think those cultural norms are. And what is right is what society suggests is right. And it's the type of thing that's going to lead society to see us as good girls and good boys. Those are the terms that Kohlberg used for this particular stage. So in the conventional stage, or the conventional period, we see people really paying attention to rules and laws. and standards, and they try to abide by those things because they feel that if they don't, then they'll look bad in the eyes of others, that others will view them differently, or society will view them differently, and that that's not okay, that that's not acceptable. So they're really concerned about other people, society in particular views them and views their behavior. But once kids or individuals, adults many times, get to that post-conventional level, he suggested that at this point they use what he called abstract ethical principles to define good and bad. That they're not as concerned about what society thinks or what society suggests is right. Instead, he argued that people who are reasoning at the post-conventional level are more concerned about their own ethical standards. And so they use these abstract ethical principles to develop their own moral code, their own standards about what's right and wrong based on big ideas, things like justice and equality. Now, there were people who were critical of Kohlberg's theory, so another theory that I want to mention before we finish up is the theory of Carol Gilligan. And Gilligan suggested that moral development may proceed differently between men and women. So she suggested that there is a gender component to all of this. So she argued that gender plays a role in the development of how we reason about those moral issues and moral dilemmas. She argued that the two sexes use very different standards of rightness, that boys are more likely to use what she called a justice perspective, while girls are more likely to use a care and responsibility perspective. So that justice perspective that she suggested boys use in their reasoning about moral issues really focuses on formal rules and how those rules define right and wrong. So what those rules say is right or wrong, that's what they pay attention to. But she suggested that girls develop more of a care and responsibility perspective. She suggested that girls are socialized to think more about individuals and relationships. And so when they reason about moral issues, it's not as strict, black and white, the rules are the rules, and if you break them, you should be in trouble. It's more of a situation by situation type of thing, where they take into account what's happening with individuals and their responsibility to caring for those individuals.